Welcome to The Cow Behind the Barn, podcast exploring humanity, the world, and the divine as experienced and interpreted by an artist. I'm Kevin Caldwell, a co-founder of the Table Collective. Are we conscious or are we consciousness? It's an odd question, I know, so let me rephrase. Is there a me other than my consciousness and my awareness? That is there a me that has consciousness? Or is what I think of as me, in fact, just consciousness itself? Is there an I that exists other than my consciousness or not? That question frames the focus of my next two episodes, and I'll come back to it in just a moment. But first, I want to try a bit of an experiment. In every episode, I use my own poems and songs in various ways to illustrate or express something related to the topics. In this case, the poem I will share is not directly connected in that way. Instead, I'm using it as a practice in mindfulness, an invitation to myself and yourself. Invitation to what? Well, I'm going to use a poem called Rooted in Sand. And as I recite it, and as you listen, what I'm inviting you to, or us to, is to experience it, to experience the groundedness, to experience the solid rest which it expresses or tries to express in the midst of the waves of whatever may be going on in life. So, for a moment, pause. Take a few deep breaths and let them out slowly. Allow yourself to be aware of what's happening inside you, thoughts, emotions, imaginings. The aim is simply to be aware of them, to see them, and then, in a sense, just sit with them and listen together with them, as it were, to the poem. Rooted in sand. Settle, self. Root, rest. Deep soul, red heart. Sound and sight rolling, waves on seawalls. Waves crest, approach, thin onto sand, pause a breath length, pull back, withdraw, crest into waves. In the waiting, the damp soaks deep but does not rest away old sand. Water soaking and sinking. Me standing, feet descending into sand, settling, deep, packed in, waiting, firm, in root and rest. Okay, now that I am in that rooted, settled place, I come back to the question of human consciousness. Are we conscious or are we consciousness? This all began actually more than 20 episodes ago with the question, where and when did I begin? And if you've been listening for any period of time, you know that. I've looked at where and the nature of the cosmos, and when and the nature of time, and then began exploring what might be the nature of the I in that question. What's the nature of consciousness, in other words? And if you've been following recent episodes, you're very aware of the approach that I'm following, in which I evaluated and then set aside definitions and instead focused on descriptions of different dimensions of consciousness and self. So for newer listeners, here's a summary. One-dimensional consciousness or self, in which a subject experiences what happens in some way but is not aware of experiencing it. Two-dimensional. A subject experiences what happens to it and is aware of experiencing it. And then three-dimensional, a subject experiences what happens, is aware of experiencing it, and is aware of being aware of all that. Now, there is a fourth category I refer to as multidimensional, and that will be the focus after we finish looking at human consciousness, for I think that category is going to ask us questions around whether there is consciousness beyond the individual human level, the level of things and animals. It's raising the question of the divine. Well, my descriptive model, which refers to just experience and awareness, is simple, maybe even simplistic. Things are obviously much more complicated than that model for us as human beings. So let me just share some examples of how complicated this can all get. We humans change developmentally. That means we're conscious in different ways as we grow from conception to embryo to birth to childhood and on into adulthood. How does that affect our understanding of the nature of consciousness and of the self? Is there a self that's the same throughout all of that? If not the same in quality or character, at least the same identity? What happens to us when we experience some form of dementia? Consciousness gets warped, but are we still ourselves? What about being in a coma or under anesthesia? What about when we sleep? What about the effects of meditation on one's consciousness and sense of self? What about altered states of consciousness that are drug-induced? In each of these different states of consciousness, are we us? Are we still ourselves? Indeed, are we still selves at all if we're not aware? Is there more to who we are than what we normally experience? Or is our experience, and even the experience of being aware that we're aware, ultimately all that we are? I spent a lot of time on rocks in earlier episodes, as you may know if you listened. So I feel compelled to ask, when we're not aware, don't we then more closely resemble being rocks? And is there still something to us in that state? So, what does consciousness mean? What is a self? Well, back to the question that I asked at the very beginning of the episode. Obviously, are we conscious or are we consciousness? And that's a question that cuts to the heart of who and what we are. Typically, I look at my different sources to see what they have to say about a question, and then I try to sort and assemble and come to some type of personal conclusion or point of view, or at least a next set of questions. In this case, what I've already gleaned from those sources as I looked at the nature of consciousness in relation to the non-human, natural world of our cosmos reveals, to me at least, a singular, narrow dividing line between two major ways to understand and describe human consciousness. I'm going to call it a continental divide in the theories of physics and philosophy and the religions. For those of you outside the United States, that term refers to the spine of the Rocky Mountains, which runs north and south through America, and from which rivers flow either to the west or to the east from that central point. Now, relative to the nature of consciousness, various theories of philosophy, religions, and physics, there are theories which are streams, and those streams flow either east or west from the divide that I'm going to mention. Those streams then recombine and they form major rivers, which each contain the waters or theories of different approaches in physics, different schools of philosophy, and different religious heritages. In other words, there's schools of philosophy and interpretations of physics and religious heritages which answer one way and are similar to each other. And there are schools of philosophy and interpretations of physics and religious heritages which answer the other side. The continental divide is, as you may suspect, are we conscious on one side or are we consciousness on the other? Now, let me introduce the way that physics, philosophy, and religion form rivers together to answer that question in different ways. I'm going to do an overview of both sides of the divide for now, and then look more closely at just one side for the remainder of this episode. So first, we are conscious. Quantum physics says that there, or at least within quantum physics, there are some physicists who conclude that there must be some sort of consciousness that's behind the apparently random actions of some subatomic particles, including those which make up the electrochemical functions of our human brains. There is something, there's a center other than just the result of subatomic particle activity that we call thought. Philosophy. In the philosophical approach to consciousness known as dualism, there's the view that the source of consciousness, if not consciousness itself, is non-physical in some sense. There's, of course, many varieties of dualism, but in one way or another, this is the view within philosophy that electrochemical processes of the brain cannot sufficiently account for consciousness, not on their own. There's an I, deeper or more essential than cognitive functions, of which our cognitive functions are symptomatic, are signs. This includes philosophers who intentionally engage with quantum physics in this area, which is, of course, an increasing activity within philosophy, and vice versa. As quantum physicists theorize about things, they're actually functioning much like philosophers. And then the religions. In this case, the dividing line of Eastern versus Western religious traditions, which I've talked about in prior episodes, doesn't actually reveal the sort of clear difference of perspective that I've noted in prior sessions. So, for example, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and also Hindu traditions, and as far as I can assess, also Taoist traditions, are all ways of seeing that describe a form of mind or self that is other than consciousness as we experience it. There's some sort of an I that has consciousness, whether that is a human I or an I that is other than an individual human. So, for example, in Hinduism, small a Atman or big A Atman. Well, what about the other river on the other side of this continental divide, the we are consciousness side? Quantum physics. There are physicists who, while accepting that the activity of subatomic particles is certainly mysterious, are nonetheless convinced that if the conditions provided by warm, wet brains were not present, there would be no consciousness, and then no self having consciousness. Now, this is not quite the same thing as saying we are consciousness. It's probably more accurate to say that this view says we are the electrochemical processes that generate consciousness. But this stream fits those rivers flowing on this side of the divide because there's no other I if consciousness doesn't exist or if it ceases. And then there's philosophy. In philosophy, the theory of mind and consciousness known, for example, as materialism, equates consciousness with the brain, or more specifically, with the brain's neural activity. It's a philosophical expression of the view of physics that we just noted. That activity is what consciousness is, and so ultimately that's what we are and what the self is. And then there's the religions. And I'm going to oversimplify things, but what I'm going to say is true enough, I think, for the purpose of this episode. And that's this, that Buddhism actually stands, as far as I can see, nearly alone among the major religious heritages in its view that there is no self that has consciousness. The self is the cognitive flow we call consciousness, and consciousness is that self. If the flow ceases, there's no I that continues, at least not in an independent, isolated sense. And that's where things can get sort of complicated with Buddhism. So while beginning from a very different starting point than the philosophy of materialism, while differing in many important ways, especially in its view of the material world, Buddhism and materialism share the same end result, that consciousness is not rooted in a source other than itself. Now that I have summarized the two rivers for the rest of this episode, I'm going to focus more on the second river, which is this we are consciousness river. So first, I want to look more closely at this whole conversation about the Buddhist understanding of it, and then I'll turn to physics and philosophy. So let me share a little bit more about Buddhism and the self. We've noted in prior episodes that one of the core elements in the Buddhist teaching is what he called non-self or even unself. It's a difficult term to translate. What the Buddha meant by this is that there is no permanent something that experiences events and stimuli. Within you or I or any subject that is aware or is aware of being aware, there is nothing other than the awareness itself. There's no self doing that, no self having that abides through it all. What I am, what I call me, is a constant flow of those experiences and mental states. Consciousness is nothing other than that flow. What I think is me, what I think is my I, is simply those experiences and states of mind. Now, I can't ask Buddha what happens when we're unconscious, say due to anesthesia or in a coma or have dementia. Does the flow just stop? Does it change? I'm not sure what he would say in response to all that. But there are streams of Buddhism that might suggest the ways that at least some Buddhists would respond. And they have to do with what is called the Buddha nature, and I'm going to take that up when I look at the river on the other side of the divide. For now, I'm going to let it suffice to say that mainstream Buddhism says that we are consciousness, and consciousness in that sense is what we are. Let me turn to physics and the view of physics that aligns with the philosophy that is called materialism. There's a division actually in the scientific community, the community of physicists especially, just as there is in the religious world here, between whether the source of consciousness, indeed its entire reality, is material or non-material. The material view is that consciousness results from and is dependent for its existence and functions upon the physical conditions of a warm, wet brain. Quantum theory is often used to suggest the opposite of materialism, as I've noted before, namely that there are phenomena, especially at the subatomic level, which are inexplicable, according to this view, in a materialist framework. Quantum physics deals with the nature of matter and energy and how matter and energy behave at the atomic and subatomic levels. And that behavior includes phenomena physicists describe with terms like wave activity and superposition and entanglement, which seem counterintuitive to our everyday experiences of the world. However, physicists who align with a materialist view of the world also appeal, obviously, to quantum physics to support that worldview. A materialist application of quantum theory would argue that while quantum physics actually quantum physics strengthens materialism by providing a comprehensive description of reality, even if that reality is more complex than what we experience and understand. That is, in a materialist framework, quantum physics portrays consciousness as a very complicated and complex emergent property of physical processes. Now, it seems to me that how one interprets quantum theory on this point, related to materialism and its implications relative to consciousness, actually depends upon conclusions reached through different lenses. Quantum physicists differ on this, and I think they do so because of prior conclusions, a prior set of lenses through which they're looking, namely religion or philosophy. I mentioned Buddhism above, so let me actually turn to philosophy here, because Buddhism is the religious view that sort of aligns with this as far as I can tell. So let me talk about materialism and the philosophy of mind. Materialism in philosophy, as in the sciences, as we've just noted, is the perspective that consciousness is a product of physical processes in the brain and that there's no non-physical mind or soul. So, in other words, the material world is the only reality. Every cognitive and psychological function and emotional function can be explained in physical terms. There's no non-material spiritual realm. The physical brain is the source of consciousness. Emotions, as I just mentioned, are chemical reactions. All phenomena are reduced or reducible to physical interactions and nothing more, including consciousness. Now, before proceeding, I need to ask a question that's been nagging at me. I don't know if it will have occurred to any of my listeners. And the question is this: Does Buddha actually belong here, Kevin? I've put the Buddha stream from the religious world on the same side of the continental divide as the materialist streams in physics and philosophy, but do these streams actually flow in the same river? The Buddha's thinking about consciousness and about the nature of the material world are very complex. And so my answer to the question that I just posed myself is actually yes and no. In Buddhist philosophy, mind and matter are seen as different ways that we experience reality. Mental experiences, including consciousness, arise from the sensations of our bodies and the perceptions and thoughts we formulate in our minds. Body and mind are entangled. Matter itself is not something fully external or even, in Buddhist thought, scientifically accessible. Our observations of matter and the reality of matter are intertwined. This, as we've seen, is almost exactly the view of quantum physics and the fact that our observation of something changes how it functions. Where Buddha could be seen to disagree with materialism is in his denial that even science can access matter as it is, matter in its real reality, I might say. Because even that purely scientific objective exercise is not, in fact, purely objective. Where Buddhist thought supports the worldview of materialism, and the reason that I put Buddha on this side of the mountain range, is that for the Buddha, there is nothing else that is real other than this entangled consciousness matter entanglement. I don't know how else to put it. At the end of the day, this is almost exactly the view taken by philosophical and scientific theories of materialism. For those also hold that consciousness does not exist apart from matter, the physical world. Buddha is simply indicating, in a way, a more reciprocal understanding of our experience of these things. Now, I could say a lot more, of course, about the Buddha and this side of the divide, but I need to get ready for the other side of the divide. But before I begin to transition to the next episode, I have another poem that I want to share. I've included it in a prior episode, but it seems very fitting here. The poem is called Roomscape. And though it doesn't answer the question of whether we are something that has consciousness or whether we are consciousness itself, it does explore consciousness from the viewpoint of an imagined possibility that we share consciousness in a mysterious way with our surroundings. Roomscape. Lead marks on paper from a pencil, moved by fingers, moved by hand, moved by bone and muscle, moved by tendon, sinew, nerve, moved by a thought shot down the path of pulse and synapse to the pencil point on a paper. In the moment of the pencil moving, tracing a thought on dull paper pulped flat from the soles of trees, further up and further in, up the hand, arm, neck, inside the gray tissue, inside the skull, another thought is already born, formed and sent on its way before the old thought finds the period on the paper. In the room, two cats playing, purring, pausing, staring into the dark hallway at the things cats see in the spaces beyond my sight. Inside square walls, there is a tiny orange flash of fish, moved by some liquid synapse, or lure, or longing I cannot sense. A plant above and to my right, tamed and potted in soil from the loam of some raw and wild land, spilling leaves and stems down the bookshelf's breast, trellised green and yellow. Toys are askew, scattered residue of a 3-year-old's make-believe. She sleeps in a crib that stands on a floor that is the ceiling above me. A daughter, firstborn of 3, sleeps above me to my left, mother of a firstborn of her own across the hall, not yet stirring in the crib. Behind a door to my right, another sleeper. We have 50 years of waking, walking, bed and bread, breath inhaled and exhaled, a weathered life of days together. These rooms are breathing. The night has inhaled a passing day, held its breath deep in moonlight lungs up to the point of exhale, releasing a tomorrow that will be today, a wind that will carry us afloat from dawn down to dusk and the next breath swallowed in deep. The woman breathing, the daughter and the daughter's daughter breathing, the cat breathing, the fish breathing. I am breathing. I inhale the breath of the breathing room, into lung, to blood, to brain, down the muscle and tendon and bone, down to fingers laced around a pencil, to the dulling point scratching, to the traces of lead on paper, to lines shaped into sticks, circles and twists and spots. The gray dust on paper is inhaled by other eyes. They draw in deep the scratches of the pencil on the page, into lung, to blood, to brain, down again through muscle and tendon and bone and vein. Well, now where to from here? I mentioned above that it seems to me the interpretations of, say, quantum physics about materialism or non-materialism seem to be decided by prior convictions reached in other ways, drawing from perhaps philosophy and religion. Now, in my view, science can and should reframe one's philosophical and religious understanding as well. I think it's a two-way street, and it should be. Whether a physicist sees quantum theory as supporting materialism or not does often, at least as far as I can tell, seem to depend on prior convictions which have been arrived at through different means. That one's philosophical or religious conclusions, as I've said, and the convictions that come from that have a huge say in how one interprets quantum theory and how one explains its counterintuitive conclusions about the way that what we think of as material reality actually functions. Now, as I say, I think it's a two-way street, and that it should be. Our views and ways of seeing can be and should be an ongoing interplay of science, philosophy, if you will, which is simply a way of reflecting on things, religion, and imagination, I would add, and experience and intuition. One of the themes of the podcast is that we know things in all sorts of different ways, and we need to welcome all of them into this interplay. In the next episode, I'm going to travel over the mountains to the other side of the divide and look at the philosophical and religious views in those streams and rivers, as well as the scientific ones, and the ones that the views, in other words, on that other side of the divide that view consciousness as rooted in something other. Views that do not reduce reality to matter. And we'll be looking at the question of not are we consciousness, but are we conscious? So, until next time.